sometimes I say that by the time an idea becomes conventional wisdom, that it's definitely wrong, because to state it as a conventional wisdom, it has to be stated without all the qualifiers and the caveats and the ifs and the buts. And in that form, it's sure to be wrong. So a lot of what, sort of if I had to, psychoanalyze myself, I think a lot of it is this sort of resistance to conventional wisdom. Sometimes I think that if we lived today in completely autarkic economies, that I would be sort of, an advocate for free trade rather than sort of my, the way that I'm perceived as a kind of a more, a critic of hyperglobalization. But I think it's partly trying to get that balance, and I think that balance has sometimes has been missing in the past.
I'm here today with Dani Rodrik. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard University. Dani, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
We're here to talk about the Economists for Inclusive Prosperity. So why did you found the Economists for Inclusive Prosperity? What's inspired?
Well, I think the most the quickest way to put it is to say that we felt that economists had to be part of the solution and not the problem, and not that I think on the whole that the economics profession has been a problem, but I think there is a perception out there that economists and economics is sort of the high priest of efficiency and growth, and that's the only thing that they care about, and all the other important values of inclusion, equity, opportunity for all are things that should be left to others. I think we have come, to the realization that our societies are facing significant challenges, and it has also significant political implications. And for some time, it had been obvious to me that there was already significant ferment within the economics profession, especially younger economists working in their own corners of the discipline, whether it's in public finance, in labor economics, in industrial organization, on environmental economics. There's a lot of policy-oriented work that's going on, with some very interesting cross-cutting themes about worrying about the rules behind the markets, worrying about the incidence of policies, and not just sort of efficiency and aggregate performance. And I and my colleagues thought that it was important to bring this work, both to sort of showcase it for non-economists, but also for people within economics to realize that there's sort of a very similar developments going on in different parts of the discipline, in the hope that we could show that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that there is some broad aggregate vision that comes out of this.
You created a mosaic with your first document that spans many, many issues, very talented people. Yeah,
we thought we would start out with very short, pithy policy briefs that sort of put on paper essentially what we meant in a number of different fields, and our policy briefs cover social policy, labor policy and minimum wages, unionization, taxation of international corporations, international trade policy, financial regulation, all the way to political economy, sort of, how to get people to show up at the voting booth, increase participation, and unmake some of the distortions in the political sphere. So we wanted to show that there is a very sort of broad cross-current of work. And as you said, it was also important to show that sort of younger economists get engaged in this, and it's not just people who are now worrying about public issues, sort of at a late stage in their career, but younger economists are deeply engaged in these issues.
Well, when I critique economics, which is sort of my job, I often talk about how people are viewed as optimizing on a free, open whiteboard in their life. But when applied to economists who have the peer-reviewed journals, research assessment exercises that relate to the context and support for their own vitality, it's very clear that there's, which you might call, a layer of tribal anthropology. A great education theorist, Ken Robinson, once said, everyone has an imagination, but creativity is an act of will. So the question is, how much will does one have to be creative in some realms? And I think your organization helps lower that threshold and encourage people to join.
I hope so, and that's clearly, that's one of our objectives, that I think partly we wanted to change professional norms and expectations and the sociology of the profession, that it's that it's actually okay to do policy-related work. It's okay to speak about the big issues of the day while you are still an assistant professor. That doesn't detract from your work as a scholar and researcher, as author of papers in peer-reviewed journals. In fact, that these two things reinforce each other. And that's why I'm so excited about having younger academics involved in this, because I think it's going to be very important for as assistant professors, associate professors do this kind of work, then it becomes okay for doctoral students and graduate students to think more also about policy issues and to have their voice. I think one of the reasons that the economics profession has gotten a bad rap in the public sphere is that our public voice has been monopolized by a rather narrow segment of senior scholars. Mm-hmm. So I think I've always felt that public at large sees only a very narrow sliver of the work that gets done and the diversity of views within the economics profession. So in the field that's closest to mine, in international trade, typically we've got scholars with hyper-globalist views sort of presenting the views of the economics profession. I think the more people we can get engaged in the public debates with serious scholarly credentials, the more we're able to display this variety of views, this variety of perspectives.
Where I'm most critical is that our textbooks reflect too much of that simplicity and not enough of what scholars know and understand to be what you might call the dilemmas or yin and yang of many of these issues.
And I think, I think once again, I think the textbooks and the introductory courses in economics are, I think, lagging behind where the profession has moved. I think as the discipline has become more empirical, more applied, more institutions and political economy oriented, and partly as a result, more engaged in the real world, in how the world works, as opposed to ex ante theorizing, that I think it's become richer and much better. Mm-hmm. But too often, I think, in our textbooks and our introductory economics courses, we are too keen to sing the praises of markets and rational, selfish behavior. And I think we don't really present the best of the economics profession to those who see.
It's tricky, though. I want to give a little credence to the author of a textbook, because you're trying to illuminate basic principles to help people in the on-ramp to economics. Yes. But what you also do is indoctrinate people into a simplistic view, who many go on to business, law school, other. They become voters with a very narrow view what economics really means or has to say.
I think that's right, and I think we should do the first without doing the second, namely, give them a sense of the power of thinking as an economist, and I'm a very strong believer in that, without deluding them into thinking that there is this kind of a one-size-fits-all universal model of the economy that fits all circumstances and that's sort of best represented by our competitive supply and demand graph. But I think it's possible, and I think, as you know, in fact, the core textbook does a much better job in presenting economics, and so I think that also is changing.
Yeah, well, I think I've teased publishers by saying, if you put something out about externalities in climate change in chapter 1, people would read the whole book.
It's not just about climate change. It's really about think of the economy more as a challenge of coordination and cooperation rather than simply as decentralized markets. That markets are one possible solution to that central social dilemma of cooperation. But it is only one, and we need to understand well both the kinds of problems it solves well as the kind of problems it doesn't solve well. So I think if you start from that broader challenge of how do you get social cooperation and coordination going, then I think you can place markets in their proper perspective.
We had this era prior to modern capitalism called feudalism, and people deified the church.
Yes.
Until it was unmasked as
Yes.
not always
Yes.
on target.
Yeah.
And then we went to scientific, technocratic
Yes.
interpretation until after the Bolshevik Revolution, people thought they could take that all the way to administer the state. And when those side effects were revealed, people deified the market in the void. And I think coming back to a balance is very important.
I think probably one of the hardest thing for us is really to strike that balance. I think you're absolutely right that we want to understand both where the decentralized market mechanisms work. We want to understand well where centralized coordination mechanisms work. After all, the firm itself is a centralized coordination mechanism, and the boundaries of the firm are always being redefined. And just as the boundary between the market and governments has to be redefined, but going even beyond that, none of that really necessarily tells us anything about purpose, about what are the purposes that we ought to serve, and those have to do with values and with our fundamental beliefs about what kind of society we want to live in. And I would not want to look to an economist to tell me the answer to that, and we would obviously have very different views on that. But we need to understand that all of these have a role.
Has your thinking changed? I mean, from the days of Avinash Dixit to the present, has your thinking changed particularly? I mean, I just always thought you had great lateral pattern recognition and you'd synthesize things, but...
Well, I think one advantage I had, is coming into economics not from engineering or applied math, which is the typical path these days, but more from comparative politics and history. And I think I view this as an advantage because it gave me a sense of many things that I think technical training in economics hides, which is the value, which is understanding the need for rules behind the markets, and that those rules in turn are made by people. So the role of political institutions, power, and distribution, and so forth. So I think that has been, I guess in addition I would have to say that there's always a bit of in me a kind of I've always hated conventional wisdom, so I think it's always there's been this tendency that I want to fight whatever. Sometimes I say that by the time an idea becomes conventional wisdom, that it's definitely wrong, because to state it as a conventional wisdom, it has to be stated without all the qualifiers and the caveats and the ifs and the buts, and in that form, it's sure to be wrong. So a lot of what, sort of if I had to, psychoanalyze myself, I think a lot of it is this sort of resistance to conventional wisdom. Sometimes I think that if we lived today in completely autarkic economies, that I would be sort of, an advocate for free trade rather than sort of my, the way that I'm perceived as a kind of a more, a critic of hyperglobalization. But I think it's partly trying to get that balance, and I think that balance has sometimes has been missing in the past.
Well, I notice in this group that you set up, it's exclusively academic.
Yes.
And so you went to the well of the people who have that freedom and responsibility.
Yes.
To step forward.
Yeah, so two things that people sometimes ask about EfIP, as we call it, Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. Two things. One is, you talk about, being inclusive, but it's only for economists, and secondly, it's only for academics. Why do you do that? I think our thinking was that academic economists, especially younger academic economists, are probably today the biggest untapped reservoir of thinking about policy issues. That there's a lot of work that's in the journals and that people are researching about that don't necessarily percolate up into the policy discussions. And because of this, the problems with the sociology of the profession, that younger economists are not encouraged to speak out in public. That was the group that we really wanted to reach out, and hence to start out with academic economists. That doesn't mean that we're against interdisciplinary collaboration. We obviously, all of us work with scholars from other fields. And it certainly doesn't mean that we think that this work can be done only by academics and scholars, far from it. But it was our way of trying to reach the group that we think is most under-engaged in the public sphere with these kinds of discussions. And I hope that as this network grows, that our connections will grow as well.
But that's also a place where, given your leadership in the profession, in this, what I'll call synthesis and multidisciplinary integration, sets the tone. And by providing that to these people, it's kind of a healing gesture for the profession that you've lived in, where your credibility is based. And I'll put 8 or 9 other people in that with you, and Nadet Mahdi and Atif and others are.
I'm really thrilled at how many sort of younger economists are involved in this venture, and we have a dozen or so as the founding members, and then we have another dozen or so who have already committed to write short policy briefs for us in the months ahead, and we have a bunch of other activities that are planned. But I'm really excited because we're able to get younger academics engaged with this, and ultimately I hope that they will take the flag and run with it.
Well, I'm how you say, grinning inside, because when you first were announced, one of my board members called me and said, I think there are 7 INET grantees in that original group. And I said, okay.
That was not a criterion, but it was I'm not entirely surprised either.
But people like Suresh Naidu, Kaplan, Dubé, just on and on and on, and Nadet Mahdi for her book. And and obviously you work with us on the Global Commission for Global Economic Transformation, and you've got one of your mentees, Jack Gao, sitting in the room, helping me every day. So, but I felt very excited to see both that you took the step forward to do this and the collection of people that you brought along with you.
Great, thanks. And Rob, I look forward to working with INET on this.
Well, we look forward to seeing your work and seeing how we can support it and amplify it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rob.
Good luck on your new endeavor.
Thanks for this conversation.
We'll do what we can, like I said, to support you and be cheering for you.